The spark that ignited the world on a warm Sunday morning in June 1914, a young Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip stood at a street corner in Sarajevo. His actions in the next few moments would alter the course of human history. As the open-top car carrying Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie slowed at an intersection, Princip stepped forward and fired two shots. Within minutes, both the Archduke and his wife lay dead. This seemingly isolated act of political terrorism would, within weeks, plunge Europe and eventually much of the world into the most devastating conflict humanity had yet witnessed. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, serves as a perfect illustration of how a single event can function as both spark and powder keg. While the killing itself was carried out by a small group of conspirators, it occurred against a backdrop of intense nationalist sentiment, imperial rivalry, and a complex web of military alliances that had transformed Europe into a tinderbox of competing interests. The shots fired in Sarajevo did not cause World War I in isolation. Rather, they ignited long-simmering tensions that European powers had been struggling to contain for decades. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, Austria-Hungary, convinced of Serbian involvement in the plot, issued an intentionally harsh ultimatum to the Serbian government. Serbia's partial rejection of these demands set in motion a series of diplomatic maneuvers and military mobilizations that rapidly escalated beyond control. Within 5 weeks of the assassination, the major European powers had declared war on one another, drawing in their colonial possessions and allies across the globe. What began as a localized conflict in the Balkans transformed into the first truly global war. The significance of the assassination extends far beyond its role as a historical trigger point. It represents the culmination of 19th century European politics and the birth of the 20th century's geopolitical realities. The event exposed the fragility of the European balance of power system that had maintained relative peace since the Napoleonic Wars. It revealed how nationalism, militarism, and imperial competition had created a situation where a regional crisis could rapidly escalate into worldwide conflict. This video aims to examine the assassination not merely as a historical curiosity, but as a critical moment that illuminates the complex interplay of forces that shape the modern world. We will explore how the killing of the Archduke served as both catalyst and symptom of deeper structural problems in European society and politics. By understanding the context, execution, and consequences of this pivotal event, we gain insight into the nature of international relations, the dangers of nationalism, and the often unpredictable ways in which history unfolds. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand stands as a sobering reminder of how individual actions can intersect with broader historical forces to produce consequences far beyond what anyone might have anticipated. As we examine the events of that fateful day in Sarajevo and the crisis that followed, we will uncover not just what happened, but why it happened, and how its repercussions continue to shape our world more than a century later. Through this exploration, we gain not only historical knowledge, but also wisdom about the fragile nature of peace and the complex causes of conflict in human society. To understand the magnitude of the assassination, we must first understand the man who was killed. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, born on December 18, 1863, was not merely another royal figure, but the heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne. As the nephew of Emperor Franz Joseph I, he stood to inherit leadership of one of Europe's oldest and most complex imperial powers. The Archduke was a complex and often contradictory figure, stern and militaristic in bearing, yet harboring relatively progressive views on the empire's future. Unlike many in the Habsburg court, Franz Ferdinand recognized the unsustainability of the dual monarchy's existing structure. He advocated for a triple monarchy that would grant greater autonomy to the empire's Slavic peoples alongside the Austrians and Hungarians. This position earned him enemies among Hungarian elites who feared diminished influence. Ironically, the man assassinated by South Slavic nationalists was perhaps the most prominent voice in Vienna for political reforms that might have addressed some of their grievances. The Archduke's personal life also reflected his willingness to challenge convention. His marriage to Sophie Chotek, a woman deemed of insufficient rank by the imperial court, demonstrated both his stubbornness and his capacity for deep personal loyalty. Their relationship resulted in a morganatic marriage, one where Sophie was denied the full privileges of an imperial spouse and their children excluded from succession rights. That Sophie died alongside him in Sarajevo added a poignant personal tragedy to an event of enormous political consequence. Franz Ferdinand's death removed from the European stage a figure whose accession might have altered the empire's trajectory. While it is impossible to know whether his planned reforms would have succeeded in stabilizing the multinational empire, his assassination eliminated the possibility of this alternative path. Instead, his death became the pretext for actions that would tear apart not just the Habsburg monarchy, but the entire European order. Europe on the brink, political landscape. Before 1904, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand did not occur in a vacuum. To understand why this single act of violence could trigger a global conflict, we must examine the complex and volatile political landscape of Europe in the early 20th century. By 1940, the continent had transformed into a powder keg of competing national interests, military buildups, and entangling alliances that required only a spark to ignite. The Europe of 1914 bore little resemblance to the continent of a century earlier. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 had established a balance of power system that provided relative stability for decades. However, by the dawn of the 20th century, this system had eroded significantly. The unification of Germany in 1871 following the Franco-Prussian War fundamentally altered European power dynamics. The emergence of a strong, industrialized German state in the heart of Europe disrupted the careful equilibrium that had previously existed. Under the leadership of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the newly unified Germany initially pursued a cautious foreign policy aimed at preventing hostile coalitions. Bismarck crafted a complex system of treaties and alliances designed to isolate France, which harbored deep resentment over its defeat in 1871 and the loss of the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. However, after Kaiser Wilhelm II dismissed Bismarck in 1890, German foreign policy took a more aggressive turn, abandoning Bismarck's restraint in favor of Weltpolitik, a global policy that sought to establish Germany as a world power. This shift in German policy contributed significantly to the formation of two opposing alliance systems that would eventually clash in World War I. The Triple Alliance, formalized in 1882, united Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy in a defensive pact. Though Italy's commitment would prove unreliable when war came, the alliance represented a powerful bloc in Central Europe. Germany's alliance with Austria-Hungary was particularly strong, binding the fate of these two empires together in ways that would prove fateful in the summer of 1914. In response to the Triple Alliance and growing German power, France, Russia, and Britain gradually formed their own coalition. France and Russia signed a military convention in 1892, creating a counterweight to German influence. Britain, traditionally maintaining a policy of splendid isolation, gradually aligned with France and Russia due to growing concerns about German ambitions. The Anglo-French Entente Cordiale of 1904 and the Anglo-Russian Agreement of 1907 completed what became known as the Triple Entente. While not as formal as the Triple Alliance, these agreements created a second power bloc that transformed Europe into two armed camps. The division of Europe into these alliance systems created a situation where a conflict between any two powers risked drawing in all the others. As German General Helmut von Moltke observed, a European war would be a world war which will change the face of Europe. The alliances removed flexibility from diplomatic relations and created a dangerous rigidity in international affairs. When crisis came in 1914, these alliances functioned as mechanisms for escalation rather than restraint. Alongside these diplomatic developments, Europe experienced an unprecedented military buildup. The German army, already considered the finest in Europe, continued to expand under the provisions of successive army bills. France, with a smaller population, struggled to match German military strength and compensated by extending the length of military service. Russia, following its humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, embarked on an ambitious program of military reforms and rearmament. Perhaps most significant was the naval arms race between Germany and Britain. The British Royal Navy had long maintained unquestioned supremacy at sea, which Britain considered essential to its security as an island nation and global empire. When Germany began an aggressive program of naval construction under Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, Britain perceived a direct threat to its vital interests. The launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906, a revolutionary battleship that rendered all previous warships obsolete, only accelerated the naval competition. Both nations committed enormous resources to building increasingly powerful fleets, heightening tensions and suspicions between them. Economic and colonial competition further exacerbated European rivalries. By the early 20th century, European powers had carved up much of Africa and established spheres of influence in Asia. Germany, as a late arrival to the colonial game, felt entitled to a place in the sun commensurate with its economic and military power. This led to colonial crises, particularly with France and Morocco in 1905 and 1911, that brought Europe to the brink of war. While these crises were resolved diplomatically, they left a legacy of mistrust and resentment. The economic dimension of European competition was equally significant. Germany's rapid industrialization had transformed it into an economic powerhouse that increasingly challenged British commercial dominance. By 1914, Germany had surpassed Britain in steel production and chemical manufacturing, and was rapidly closing the gap in other industrial sectors. This economic rivalry reinforced strategic competition and contributed to the sense that a decisive confrontation between the established powers and the rising German state was inevitable. Underlying these geopolitical tensions was a cultural and intellectual climate that made war seem not only possible, but perhaps necessary and even desirable. Social Darwinist ideas about competition between nations, glorification of military virtues, and beliefs in the purifying effects of conflict permeated European society. Military leaders in several countries believed that war was inevitable and that delay would only benefit their adversaries. This cult of the offensive led to military planning that emphasized rapid mobilization and preemptive strikes, creating a situation where crisis could quickly spiral out of control. By 1914, Europe had become a continent divided against itself, with competing alliances, arms races, imperial rivalries, and nationalist passions creating a volatile international environment. The assassination in Sarajevo would provide the spark, but the kindling had been carefully arranged over decades. When crisis came, the rigid alliance systems, military plans emphasizing speed over deliberation, and atmosphere of mutual suspicion combined to transform a Balkan crisis into a global catastrophe. The political landscape of pre-1914 Europe had created conditions where peace hung by an increasingly frayed thread, waiting for a single event to sever it completely: nationalism and tensions in the Balkans. While great power rivalries and alliance systems created dangerous tensions across Europe, nowhere was the situation more volatile than in the Balkans. This southeastern corner of Europe, long described as the powder keg of Europe, represented a complex intersection of imperial ambitions, emerging nationalisms, and religious divisions. By the early 20th century, the Balkan Peninsula had become the most unstable region in Europe, where the decline of one empire and the ambitions of others created conditions for conflict that would ultimately engulf the world. For centuries, much of the Balkans had been under Ottoman Turkish rule. The Ottoman Empire, once a formidable power that had threatened the heart of Europe, entered a long period of decline in the 18th and 19th centuries. This decline accelerated in the 19th century, creating a power vacuum that neighboring empires and emerging nationalist movements sought to fill. As Ottoman authority weakened, the Christian populations of the Balkans increasingly asserted their national identities and aspirations for independence. The process of Ottoman retreat from Europe began with the Greek War of Independence, 1821-1832, which established Greece as the first independent nation to emerge from Ottoman territories in the Balkans. This success inspired other Balkan peoples to pursue their own national aspirations. The Congress of Berlin in 1878 marked another significant step in this process, recognizing the independence of Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, while establishing Bulgaria as an autonomous principality within the Ottoman Empire. These newly independent Balkan states, however, faced significant challenges. Their borders rarely corresponded to ethnic or linguistic boundaries, creating minorities within each state who often looked to neighboring countries as their true national homeland. Furthermore, these young nations harbored ambitious territorial goals, often envisioning borders that encompassed lands still under Ottoman control or claimed by rival Balkan states. These overlapping territorial claims created a web of competing nationalisms that made regional stability nearly impossible. Among these emerging nationalisms, Serbian national aspirations proved particularly significant for the events leading to World War I. Serbia had gained autonomy within the Ottoman Empire in the early 19th century and full independence in 1878. However, many Serbs lived outside the borders of the Serbian state, particularly in Bosnia, Croatia, and other regions of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Serbian nationalists developed the concept of Greater Serbia, which envisioned uniting all Serbs in a single nation-state. This vision inevitably brought Serbia into conflict with Austria-Hungary, which ruled over substantial Serb populations. The Kingdom of Serbia, though small, pursued an ambitious foreign policy aimed at expanding its territory and influence. Under the Karađorđević dynasty, which came to power after a bloody coup in 1903, Serbia increasingly oriented its foreign policy toward Russia, which positioned itself as the protector of Slavic and Orthodox peoples in the Balkans. This Russian backing emboldened Serbia in its confrontations with Austria-Hungary and contributed to the great power dimensions of Balkan conflicts. Austria-Hungary viewed Serbian nationalism with growing alarm. The multinational Habsburg Empire, comprising numerous ethnic groups, including substantial Slavic populations, was particularly vulnerable to nationalist movements. Habsburg officials feared that Serbian ambitions could inspire similar movements among the empire's own South Slavic subjects, potentially leading to the disintegration of the empire. This fear led Austria-Hungary to adopt increasingly hostile policies towards Serbia. The Austro-Hungarian annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908 marked a critical turning point in Balkan tensions. These provinces, nominally under Ottoman sovereignty but administered by Austria-Hungary since 1878, contained large Serb populations that Serbian nationalists considered part of their national territory. When Austria-Hungary formally annexed these provinces in October 1908, Serbia responded with outrage and mobilized its army. The crisis brought Europe to the brink of war, as Russia initially supported Serbia before backing down in the face of German support for Austria-Hungary. The annexation crisis poisoned relations between Serbia and Austria-Hungary. It also intensified nationalist sentiments among South Slavs, both within Serbia and in the Habsburg territories. Revolutionary organizations emerged, dedicated to achieving South Slavic unity through violent means if necessary. The most notorious of these was Unification or Death, commonly known as the Black Hand, formed by Serbian army officers in 1911. This secret society would later play a crucial role in the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913 further destabilized the region. In the First Balkan War, October 1912, May 1913, an alliance of Balkan states, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, successfully drove the Ottoman Empire from nearly all its remaining European territories. However, the victors quickly fell out over the division of the conquered territories, leading to the Second Balkan War, June-August 1913, in which Bulgaria fought against its former allies and was decisively defeated. Serbia emerged from the Balkan Wars significantly enlarged, nearly doubling its territory and population. This success heightened Serbian confidence and ambitions, while intensifying Austria-Hungary's determination to check Serbian power. The Habsburg Empire had prevented Serbia from gaining an Adriatic coastline by supporting the creation of an independent Albania, further embittering relations between Vienna and Belgrade. By 1914, the Balkans had experienced 2 decades of increasing instability, with 2 near-general European wars, in 1908 and 1912-13, narrowly averted. The Ottoman Empire had been almost entirely pushed out of Europe, creating a vacuum that the Balkan states and great powers competed to fill. Serbia had emerged as a more powerful and confident state, while Austria-Hungary grew increasingly concerned about its ability to maintain control over its South Slavic territories. The volatile mix of declining imperial power, rising nationalisms, and great power interference had transformed the Balkans into Europe's most dangerous region. When Gavrilo Princip, a young Bosnian Serb nationalist, assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, he lit the fuse to this Balkan powder keg. The explosion would not remain contained to southeastern Europe, but would spread through the alliance systems to engulf the continent and eventually much of the world. The Balkan context of the assassination is crucial for understanding why this event triggered a global conflict. The killing represented not just an attack on the Habsburg monarchy, but the culmination of decades of nationalist tensions and imperial rivalries in a region where local conflicts had become inextricably linked to the interests of Europe's great powers. When Austria-Hungary responded to the assassination by moving against Serbia, it set in motion a chain reaction that would transform a Balkan crisis into the First World War. The road to Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand's fateful visit. The decision to send Archduke Franz Ferdinand to Sarajevo in June 1914 would prove to be one of the most consequential choices in modern history. To understand why this visit occurred and why it became the flashpoint for global conflict, we must examine both the man at the center of these events and the volatile environment into which he stepped. The Archduke's personal history, political views, and the specific circumstances of his visit to Bosnia created a perfect storm that would ultimately engulf the world. Franz Ferdinand was born on December 18, 1863, in Graz, Austria, to Archduke Karl Ludwig, the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, and Princess Maria Annunziata of Bourbon-Two Sicilies. He was not originally destined for the imperial succession. However, a series of tragedies, the suicide of Crown Prince Rudolf in 1889 and the death of his father in 1896, thrust Franz Ferdinand into the position of heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne. This unexpected path to potential power shaped both his outlook and how others perceived him. The Archduke developed into a complex and often contradictory figure. Physically, he cut an imposing figure, tall, with piercing eyes and a distinctive mustache that emphasized his stern demeanor. He was known for his brusque manner, stubborn temperament, and conservative social views. Yet beneath this rigid exterior lay a man with surprisingly progressive political ideas regarding the empire's future structure. Franz Ferdinand maintained a passionate interest in military affairs, serving as Inspector General of the Austro-Hungarian Armed Forces, a position that reflected his significant influence on military policy. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Franz Ferdinand's character was his marriage to Countess Sophie Chotek. The Habsburg court operated under strict rules of dynastic marriage, permitting unions only with members of reigning or formerly reigning houses. Sophie, though aristocratic, did not meet these exacting standards. Despite intense opposition from the imperial court and Emperor Franz Joseph himself, Franz Ferdinand refused to abandon his love. In 1900, he was finally permitted to marry Sophie, but only after agreeing to a morganatic arrangement, meaning that neither Sophie nor their children would inherit his rank, titles, or the throne. This personal struggle against the rigid Habsburg system reflected Franz Ferdinand's willingness to challenge convention when he believed it necessary. It also meant that on official occasions, Sophie was subjected to humiliating protocol restrictions that emphasized her inferior status. The visit to Sarajevo would be a rare exception where she could appear alongside her husband with full honors, a fact that may have influenced their decision to proceed with the visit despite security concerns. Politically, Franz Ferdinand represented a potential path of reform for the increasingly unstable Austro-Hungarian Empire. He recognized that the dual monarchy structure established in 1867, which gave privileged positions to the German-speaking Austrians and Magyars of Hungary while marginalizing Slavic populations, had become unsustainable. The Archduke advocated for a trialism approach that would elevate the South Slavs to equal status with Austrians and Hungarians, potentially transforming the dual monarchy into a triple monarchy. This position earned Franz Ferdinand powerful enemies, particularly among Hungarian elites who feared losing their privileged position. It also made his relationship with the South Slavic subjects of the empire complex. While his reforms might have addressed some grievances of these populations, many South Slavic nationalists viewed any Habsburg rule as illegitimate and sought complete independence rather than reform within the imperial structure. The purpose of Franz Ferdinand's visit to Sarajevo in June 1914 was multifaceted. Officially as Inspector General of the Armed Forces, he was to observe military maneuvers being conducted in Bosnia. These exercises, held on June 26th and 27th, demonstrated Austria-Hungary's military presence in this recently annexed territory. Following these maneuvers, the Archduke and his wife planned to visit Sarajevo on June 28th for a series of civic engagements, including the opening of a state museum. The timing of this visit revealed either a remarkable insensitivity to local sentiment or a deliberate show of imperial authority. June 28th was St. Vitus Day, Vidovdan, a date of profound significance in Serbian national consciousness. It marked the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, when Serbian forces were defeated by the Ottoman Empire, an event central to Serbian national identity. In 1914, it also represented a powerful symbol of resistance to foreign rule. Scheduling an imperial visit on this day could easily be interpreted as a provocation. The political climate in Bosnia in 1914 was extraordinarily tense. The province had been under Austro-Hungarian administration since 1878, but was formally annexed only in 1908, triggering the international crisis discussed in the previous chapter. This annexation had been deeply resented by many of Bosnia's Serbian population, who comprised about 43% of the province. Revolutionary nationalist groups had developed among Bosnian youth, often with connections to similar organizations in Serbia. Security concerns for the visit were significant and recognized by various officials. The governor of Bosnia, General Oskar Podirek, was responsible for security arrangements but failed to take adequate precautions. The military maneuvers had drawn many troops away from Sarajevo, leaving the city with reduced security presence. The route of the Archduke's procession was published in advance, making it easy for potential assassins to plan their attack. Most critically, local police forces were not supplemented with additional security personnel, despite intelligence suggesting potential threats. Several warnings about possible assassination attempts were either ignored or not taken seriously enough. The Serbian government had received information about a potential plot and attempted to warn Austrian officials, though the sincerity and clarity of this warning remained disputed. Within Bosnia itself, there were rumors of assassination plots that should have prompted greater caution. Konrad von Hotzendorf, chief of the Austro-Hungarian General Staff and a close associate of Franz Ferdinand, had advised against the visit due to security concerns. Despite these warnings, the visit proceeded as planned. Franz Ferdinand himself displayed characteristic stubbornness in refusing to alter his schedule. Some historians suggest that the Archduke, known for his personal courage, may have deliberately chosen to demonstrate Habsburg authority in this troubled province through his presence. Others point to the opportunity the visit provided for Sophie to appear alongside her husband with full honors as a motivating factor in their decision to proceed. As the Archduke's motorcade prepared to enter Sarajevo on the morning of June 28, 1914, the stage was set for tragedy. A group of young Bosnian Serb revolutionaries, armed with bombs and pistols, had positioned themselves along the published route. The security arrangements were inadequate. The political atmosphere was charged with nationalist tension, and the imperial visitor represented both the authority they resented and, ironically, perhaps the best hope for reform within the Habsburg system. The road to Sarajevo had been paved with imperial ambition, nationalist resentment, bureaucratic incompetence, and personal courage. As Franz Ferdinand and Sophie entered the city, they stepped into a moment that would transform not just their lives, but the course of world history. The shots that would soon be fired would echo far beyond the streets of this Bosnian city, triggering a conflict that would redraw the map of Europe and the world. The assassination plot, conspirators and motivations. Behind the momentous events of June 28, 1914 lay a complex web of conspirators, revolutionary organizations, and shadowy connections that stretched from the streets of Sarajevo to the highest echelons of Serbian military intelligence. The assassination plot that would trigger World War I emerged from a volatile mix of youthful idealism, revolutionary nationalism, and geopolitical calculation. Understanding who these conspirators were, what motivated them, and how they organized their plot provides crucial insight into one of history's most consequential acts of political violence. At the center of the conspiracy stood Gavrilo Princip, a slight tubercular young man of 19 whose name would become synonymous with the spark that ignited global conflict. Born to a poor peasant family in the remote Bosnian village of Obijaj in 1894, Princip's early life was marked by hardship and limited opportunities. Like many ambitious young Bosnian Serbs of his generation, he sought education as a path to advancement, eventually making his way to Sarajevo and later Belgrade for his studies. His academic performance, however, proved disappointing, and he gradually drifted toward revolutionary politics. Princip embodied the frustrations and aspirations of many young South Slavs living under Austro-Hungarian rule. Intensely idealistic and increasingly radicalized, he absorbed the revolutionary nationalist ideas circulating among student circles in the Balkans. He came to believe that violence was justified in the struggle for national liberation. In his police interrogation following the assassination, Princip articulated his motivation: I am a Yugoslav nationalist, aiming for the unification of all Yugoslavs, and I do not care what form of state, but it must be free from Austria. This statement reveals a crucial aspect of Princip's ideology. While often described simply as a Serbian nationalist, his vision actually encompassed a broader South Slavic, Yugoslav identity that would unite Serbs, Croats, and other South Slavic peoples in a single state, free from imperial control. This vision was shared by many members of Young Bosnia, Mlada Bosna, the revolutionary youth movement with which Princip was associated. Young Bosnia was not a formal organization with membership cards or a clear hierarchy, but rather a loose network of students and young intellectuals united by revolutionary nationalist ideals. Its members were predominantly ethnic Serbs, but also included some Croats and Bosnian Muslims who shared the goal of South Slavic unification and liberation from Habsburg rule. They drew inspiration from various sources, including Russian revolutionary literature, anarchist thought, and the tradition of tyrannicide, the assassination of oppressive rulers, as a morally justified political act. The young conspirators who would carry out the assassination alongside Princip came from similar backgrounds. Nedeljko Kabrinović, who would make the first attempt on the Archduke's life with a bomb, was a typesetter from a working-class family. Trifko Grabez, another key member of the plot, was a student who had been expelled from school for striking a teacher. All were young men in their late teens or early 20s, politically radicalized and willing to sacrifice themselves for their cause. Most had traveled to Belgrade, where Serbian nationalist circles provided both ideological reinforcement and, ultimately, the means to carry out their plot. While Young Bosnia provided the willing assassins, the resources, training, and logistical support for the plot came from a more organized and powerful source: the secret Serbian military society known as Unification or Death, commonly called the Black Hand. Founded in 1911 by Serbian army officers led by Colonel Dragutin Dimitrijević, known by the code name APIS, the Black Hand advocated the use of violence and terrorism to achieve the unification of all Serbian-populated territories, including those under Austro-Hungarian rule. Dimitrijević occupied a position of extraordinary influence. As head of Serbian military intelligence, he operated with considerable autonomy, sometimes pursuing policies at odds with the official position of the Serbian government. A veteran conspirator who had participated in the bloody 1903 coup that brought the Karađorđević dynasty to power in Serbia, Dimitrijević had developed a network of agents and operatives throughout the Balkans. The Black Hand established cells in Bosnia and other South Slavic regions of Austria-Hungary, recruiting disaffected youth and providing them with revolutionary literature, training, and occasionally weapons. The precise connection between the young Bosnians and the Black Hand in planning the assassination remains a subject of historical debate. What seems clear is that when Princip and his fellow conspirators arrived in Belgrade in early 1914 with vague plans to assassinate a Habsburg official, they were eventually brought into contact with Black Hand operatives who recognized an opportunity to strike at Austria-Hungary. The target was not initially Franz Ferdinand. Only when news of the Archduke's planned visit to Sarajevo reached Belgrade did he become the focus of the plot. The recruitment and preparation of the assassins followed a pattern of plausible deniability that would later allow Serbian officials to disclaim responsibility. The young conspirators were not directly recruited by Dimitrijević or other high-ranking Black Hand members, but were instead handled by intermediaries. Milan Ciganović, a Bosnian Serb living in Belgrade, with connections to both the Black Hand and Serbian border officials, played a crucial role in providing the assassins with weapons and arranging their clandestine border crossing back into Bosnia. The training of the assassins was rudimentary at best. They received basic instruction in the use of firearms and bombs in a park in Belgrade. The weapons provided, 6 bombs, 4 Browning pistols, and cyanide capsules for suicide after the assassination, came from Serbian military stocks, though they were deliberately outdated to obscure their origin. The bombs were Serbian army hand grenades, while the pistols were older models. This provision of weapons from military sources represents the most direct evidence of official Serbian involvement, though the Serbian government would later deny any knowledge of the plot. The conspirators were instructed to commit suicide after the assassination to prevent interrogation that might reveal Serbian connections. Each was given a cyanide capsule to swallow after completing their mission. This instruction reveals both the deadly seriousness of the plot and the concern about tracing the conspiracy back to Belgrade. The journey of the assassins from Belgrade to Sarajevo in early June 1914 further illustrates the shadowy network supporting the plot. Serbian border guards, likely acting under instructions from Black Hand members within the military, helped the conspirators cross into Bosnia with their weapons. Once in Bosnia, they received assistance from local sympathizers who provided safe houses and helped them reach Sarajevo in the days before the Archduke's visit. By June 28, 1914, 7 young conspirators had positioned themselves along the Archduke's published route through Sarajevo. Their plan was simple but effective: spread out along the route to provide multiple opportunities for attack, with each assassin instructed to act independently if an opportunity presented itself. This approach maximized the chances of success even if individual attempts failed, as indeed the first attempts would. The motivations behind the assassination plot operated at multiple levels. For the young assassins themselves, the act represented a blow for national liberation and South Slavic unity. They saw themselves as freedom fighters striking against imperial oppression, willing to sacrifice their lives for a greater cause. Princip later stated, "I am not a criminal, for I destroyed a bad man. I thought I was right." For the Black Hand and Dmitrievich, the assassination served more strategic goals. By eliminating the heir to the Habsburg throne, they sought to destabilize Austria-Hungary and potentially accelerate its disintegration, creating opportunities for Serbian expansion. Some historians suggest that Dmitrievich specifically targeted Franz Ferdinand because of the Archduke's plans for reform, which might have addressed South Slavic grievances and thus undermined separatist movements. The role of the official Serbian government in the plot remains controversial. Prime Minister Nikola Pasic apparently received some information about the conspiracy and made a half-hearted attempt to warn Austrian authorities, though without providing specific details. This ambiguous response suggests that while the Serbian government may not have initiated or directly supported the plot, elements within the state apparatus were willing to allow it to proceed. The assassination plot that unfolded in Sarajevo represented the convergence of youthful revolutionary idealism with strategic calculation by more powerful forces. The young assassins, motivated by nationalist fervor and dreams of liberation, became instruments in a geopolitical game with stakes far beyond what they could have imagined. As they took their positions along the Archduke's route on that fateful June morning, they stood ready to commit an act that would transform not just their own lives, but the course of world history. June 28, 1914, a day of fatal errors. The morning of June 28, 1914, dawned bright and clear in Sarajevo. The city had been decorated with flags and bunting to welcome the imperial visitors, though the choice of date, St. Vitus Day, a Serbian national holiday commemorating the 1389 Battle of Kosovo, created an undercurrent of tension as Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie prepared for their public appearances. Neither they nor their security detail could have imagined that a series of miscommunications, poor decisions, and fateful coincidences would transform this ceremonial visit into one of history's pivotal moments. The day's itinerary had been carefully planned and publicly announced in local newspapers. The Archduke and his party would travel from their accommodations at Elidza Spa outside Sarajevo to the city by train, arriving at Sarajevo railway station at approximately 10 a.m. From there, a motorcade would carry the imperial couple along Apple Quay, the main road running alongside the Miljacka River, to the city hall for an official reception. After the reception, they would continue their tour of the city, visiting the National Museum and other sites before departing in the afternoon. Security arrangements for the visit were surprisingly minimal, especially considering the political tensions in Bosnia. Governor Oskar Podirek had assigned only 120 police officers to secure the route, far fewer than would typically be deployed for such a high-profile visit. Military units that might have bolstered security had been sent to the countryside for maneuvers. The motorcade itself consisted of 6 automobiles, with Franz Ferdinand and Sophie riding in the second car alongside Governor Podirek. The cars were open-topped, providing excellent visibility for the crowds and for potential assassins. Unknown to the authorities, 7 young conspirators had positioned themselves at intervals along Apple Quay. Each was armed with a bomb and a pistol, and each had instructions to act independently if an opportunity presented itself. The assassins, Mohammed Mehmed Basic, Vaso Kubrilovic, Nedeljko Kabrinovic, Kvěko Popovic, Gavrilo Princip, Trifko Grebes, and Danilo Ilic, had spread out along the announced route, providing multiple opportunities for attack. At approximately 10:10 a.m., the motorcade departed from the railway station, proceeding slowly along Apple Quay toward the city hall. The first three conspirators, Mehmed Basic, Kubrilovic, and Popovic, failed to act as the cars passed, either losing nerve or missing their opportunity in the excitement of the moment. It was the fourth conspirator, Nedeljko Kabrinovic, who made the first attempt on the Archduke's life. As the Imperial motorcade passed his position near the Kumarja Bridge, Kabrinovic removed a bomb from his pocket, struck its detonator against a lamppost, and hurled it toward the Archduke's car. Franz Ferdinand reportedly spotted the object flying through the air and raised his arm to deflect it. The bomb bounced off the folded-back convertible cover of the car and fell into the street, where it exploded beneath the following vehicle. The explosion injured approximately 20 people, including officers in the third car and several spectators, but left the Archduke and his wife unharmed. In the confusion following the explosion, Kabrinovic swallowed his cyanide capsule and jumped into the Miljacka River to escape capture. The cyanide, however, was old and only induced vomiting rather than causing death. The river was also unusually shallow due to the summer heat, reaching only a few inches deep at that point. Kabrinovic was quickly apprehended by police and an angry crowd that began beating him before authorities intervened. After this initial attack, logic would have dictated canceling the remainder of the visit, or at minimum changing the published route and increasing security. Remarkably, neither occurred. After a brief stop to check on those injured in the bombing, the motorcade continued to the city hall as planned. The remaining conspirators, including Princip, remained at their posts, though some began to disperse, believing the opportunity had passed. At the city hall reception, a visibly shaken Franz Ferdinand interrupted the mayor's welcome speech, saying, "Mr. Mayor, I came here on a visit and I am greeted with bombs. It is outrageous." After regaining his composure, he allowed the mayor to proceed with his address. Following the reception, a crucial decision was made that would seal the Archduke's fate. Franz Ferdinand expressed a desire to visit the hospital to check on those injured in the bombing. This deviation from the original itinerary required a change in the motorcade's route. Here occurred perhaps the most fateful error of the day. Count Franz von Herrick, the owner of the cars and a member of the Archduke's party, suggested that the motorcade should avoid the city center for security reasons. Governor Poterek agreed to this change, but critically, this decision was not properly communicated to all drivers in the motorcade. The lead car, containing the chief of police, turned right off Appel Quay onto Franz Josef Street as planned in the original itinerary, rather than continuing straight along the quay toward the hospital. When the Archduke's driver followed the lead car, Governor Poterek immediately recognized the mistake and ordered the driver to stop and reverse. "What is this? This is the wrong way," he reportedly exclaimed. The driver stopped the car and began to back up, directly in front of Schiller's Delicatessen at the corner of Franz Josef Street and Appel Quay. By a remarkable coincidence, one that would change the course of history, Gavrilo Princip was standing at precisely this location. Princip had moved from his original position after the first bombing attempt, believing the opportunity for assassination had passed. He had gone to Schiller's Delicatessen, perhaps to gather his thoughts or consider his next move. When the Archduke's car stopped and began to reverse directly in front of him, Princip found himself presented with an unexpected second chance. Drawing his pistol, he stepped forward and fired 2 shots at point-blank range into the car. The first bullet struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck, severing his jugular vein. The second bullet hit Sophie in the abdomen as she instinctively moved to shield her husband. Count Herrick, who had been standing on the running board of the car as an additional security measure, heard the Archduke say, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Live for our children." These would be his last words. Both the Archduke and his wife lost consciousness almost immediately from their wounds. The driver, now aware of what had happened, raced toward the governor's residence, where it was thought medical attention might be available. By the time they arrived, both Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were dead. The Archduke had bled to death from his neck wound, while Sophie had been killed instantly by the bullet that had penetrated her abdomen and several internal organs. In the chaos following the shooting, Princip attempted to turn his gun on himself, but was seized by bystanders before he could commit suicide. He then tried to swallow his cyanide capsule, but like Kabrinovich, it only induced vomiting rather than death. Princip was beaten by the crowd before being taken into police custody. Within hours, authorities had rounded up most of the conspirators, many of whom quickly confessed their involvement in the plot. The events of June 28, 1914, represent an extraordinary concatenation of errors, coincidences, and poor decisions. Had security been adequate for such a high-profile visit, the assassination might never have occurred. Had the motorcade's route been changed after the first bombing attempt, the conspirators would have been evaded. Had the drivers been properly informed of the new route to the hospital, the fatal wrong turn would not have happened. Had Princip not happened to be standing at precisely the spot where the car stopped to reverse, he would never have had his opportunity. Each of these individual failures might seem minor in isolation, but together they created the conditions for one of history's most consequential acts of political violence. The deaths of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie would soon trigger a chain reaction of diplomatic ultimatums, mobilizations, and declarations of war that would engulf Europe and much of the world in unprecedented conflict. The fatal errors of June 28, 1914, would echo through the century that followed, reshaping the political, social, and cultural landscape of the modern world. As news of the assassination spread across Europe in the hours that followed, few could have predicted the magnitude of what would follow. The shots fired by Gavrilo Princip had not just killed an archduke and his wife. They had struck at the heart of the European order, exposing its fragility and setting in motion forces that would ultimately destroy the world as it then existed. The echoes of Gavrilo Princip's pistol shots had barely faded when Sarajevo erupted into chaos. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie triggered immediate and violent repercussions that rippled outward from the streets of the Bosnian capital to the chancelleries of Europe. In the hours and days following the killings, a series of events unfolded that would set the stage for the diplomatic crisis to come. As authorities scrambled to respond to the attack, angry mobs targeted ethnic Serbs, and governments began the fateful process of assigning blame. The immediate aftermath of the assassination saw Sarajevo transformed from a city preparing for a ceremonial visit to the scene of a manhunt and civil unrest. Princip had been apprehended at the scene, tackled by bystanders and police before he could use his cyanide capsule effectively. Bleeding and battered from the crowd's assault, he was quickly taken into custody. Nedeljko Kabrinovich, who had attempted the earlier bombing, had already been arrested after his failed suicide attempt in the shallow Miljacka River. Within hours, authorities had rounded up most of the other conspirators, many of whom were betrayed by accomplices under interrogation. The interrogation of the captured assassins began almost immediately. Princip, despite his youth and the beating he had received, displayed remarkable composure during questioning. He readily admitted to the assassination but refused to implicate others beyond those already arrested. When asked about his motives, he declared, "I am a Yugoslav nationalist, aiming for the unification of all Yugoslavs, and I do not care what form of state, but it must be free from Austria." This statement would later be used to connect the assassination to broader South Slavic nationalist movements, and, by extension, to Serbia. The conspirators' interrogations revealed the basic outline of the plot, but left crucial questions unanswered about potential connections to official Serbian institutions. Princip and his accomplices acknowledged receiving weapons and training in Belgrade, but were either unwilling or unable to identify high-ranking Serbian officials who might have been involved. Whether this reflected genuine ignorance of the plot's higher connections or a deliberate strategy to protect their Serbian supporters remains debated by historians. As the interrogations proceeded, Governor Poturek declared martial law in Sarajevo and throughout Bosnia-Herzegovina. This extraordinary measure reflected both the gravity of the assassination and fears of further violence. Military units were deployed throughout the city, public gatherings were prohibited, and a strict curfew was imposed. These security measures, however, came too late to prevent the outbreak of anti-Serb violence that would soon sweep through the city. The assassination triggered immediate and violent anti-Serb riots in Sarajevo and other cities throughout Bosnia and Croatia. Mobs of ethnic Croats and Bosnian Muslims, outraged by the killing and encouraged by nationalist newspapers, attacked Serbian businesses, homes, and cultural institutions. The offices of the Serbian newspaper, Srpska Rijeka, were ransacked, as were numerous Serbian-owned shops. Orthodox churches were vandalized, and prominent Serbs were assaulted in the streets. The violence reflected the deep ethnic tensions that had simmered beneath the surface of Austro-Hungarian rule in the Balkans. Authorities initially did little to restrain these attacks, with some local officials and police actively encouraging the violence. Only after several days did the military effectively intervene to restore order. By then, significant damage had been done, not only to Serbian property, but to any hope of peaceful coexistence between the ethnic communities of Bosnia. The riots deepened the divisions between South Slavic peoples and reinforced Serbian perceptions of persecution under Habsburg rule. Beyond the street violence, authorities launched a broader crackdown on Serbian nationalist organizations and individuals throughout Bosnia-Herzegovina. Hundreds of prominent Serbs were arrested, including political leaders, intellectuals, and Orthodox priests, many with no connection to the assassination or revolutionary activities. Serbian cultural societies were disbanded, publications were suppressed, and the use of Cyrillic script was restricted in some areas. This indiscriminate repression further alienated the Serbian population and created martyrs for the nationalist cause. The bodies of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were transported by train to Trieste and then by the battleship Viribus Unitas to Pola, modern Pula, Croatia, where a brief military ceremony was held. From there, they were taken to Vienna, arriving on July 2nd. Despite Franz Ferdinand's status as heir to the throne, the imperial court protocol, influenced by the morganatic nature of his marriage, dictated a funeral of reduced pomp. Emperor Franz Joseph, who had never fully accepted Sophie, ordered that she could not lie in state in the Habsburg crypt. The couple was ultimately buried at Archstetten Castle, Franz Ferdinand's estate, rather than in the imperial crypt in Vienna. A final slight to the Archduke and his beloved wife. Media coverage of the assassination varied dramatically across Europe, reflecting and reinforcing the political divisions that would soon lead to war. In Austria-Hungary, newspapers immediately cast the killing as an attack on the empire itself, with many explicitly blaming Serbia for the outrage. The Neue Freie Press declared that the bullets that killed the heir to the throne and his wife were not fired by a fanatical individual, but by the entire Serbian nation. Such inflammatory rhetoric helped create a public atmosphere demanding retribution against Serbia. German newspapers similarly condemned the assassination and expressed solidarity with their Austrian allies. The Kölnische Zeitung described the killing as a Serbian plot and suggested that the Serbian government cannot escape responsibility. This early German support would prove crucial in the diplomatic crisis to come, as Austria-Hungary sought assurances of German backing before taking action against Serbia. In Serbia, the initial reaction was more complex. Official statements expressed condolences and condemned the assassination, with the Serbian government declaring 3 days of mourning. However, some Serbian newspapers took a more ambivalent stance. While not openly celebrating the killings, publications like Politika emphasized the Archduke's alleged anti-Serbian positions and suggested that his death might benefit South Slavic peoples. This mixed response would later be cited by Austria-Hungary as evidence of Serbian complicity. British, French, and Russian newspapers generally condemned the assassination while avoiding the explicit anti-Serbian rhetoric of the German and Austro-Hungarian press. The Times of London described the killing as a deed of peculiar blackness, but cautioned against hasty conclusions about Serbian involvement. French and Russian publications similarly urged restraint while expressing sympathy for the Habsburg monarchy's loss. As news of the assassination spread, diplomatic communications began to assess its potential implications. Initial telegrams between capitals expressed shock and condolences, but quickly turned to analysis of possible consequences. The German ambassador in Vienna, Heinrich von Schirschke, reported to Berlin on June 30th that the prevalent opinion among the highest circles here is that a final and fundamental reckoning with Serbia must now take place. This early indication of Austria-Hungary's intentions prompted Kaiser Wilhelm II to annotate the report with his famous "now or never be ending" comment, signaling German support for decisive action. In Belgrade, the Serbian government recognized the danger of the situation and sought to distance itself from the assassination. Prime Minister Nikola Pasic issued statements condemning the killings and expressing willingness to cooperate with any investigation. Privately, however, Serbian officials worried about potential Austro-Hungarian retaliation and began discreet diplomatic outreach to their Russian allies, seeking assurances of support in case of conflict. The Russian ambassador in Vienna, Nikolai Shebeko, reported to St. Petersburg on July 1st that the assassination is being used as a weapon against Serbia, and warned that Austria-Hungary might use the incident as a pretext for military action. This early Russian assessment proved prescient and prompted initial discussions in St. Petersburg about potential responses to an Austro-Hungarian move against Serbia. Within the Austro-Hungarian government, debate quickly centered not on whether to take action against Serbia, but on what form that action should take. Foreign Minister Leopold Berchtold favored using the assassination as an opportunity to resolve the Serbian question once and for all, potentially through military means. Hungarian Prime Minister István Tisza initially urged caution, fearing that war with Serbia could draw on Russia and threaten the empire's existence. This internal debate would continue through early July, even as preparations for potential military action began. Emperor Franz Joseph, aged 84, and having already endured numerous personal tragedies, received the news of his nephew's assassination with stoic resignation. According to witnesses, he remarked, "A higher power has restored that order, which I unfortunately was unable to maintain." While personally saddened by the deaths, the emperor had never been close to Franz Ferdinand and may have viewed his passing with a certain fatalism. Nevertheless, he authorized Berchtold to begin consultations with Germany about a potential response to Serbia. By early July, the immediate aftermath of the assassination had established patterns that would shape the coming crisis. The conspirators were in custody, martial law had been imposed in Bosnia, anti-Serb violence had deepened ethnic divisions, and initial diplomatic positions were being staked out. The assassination had created an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty throughout Europe, with Austria-Hungary moving toward confrontation with Serbia, while other powers watched with growing concern. The shots fired in Sarajevo on June 28th had set in motion forces that would soon escape anyone's control. As July progressed, the local tragedy of the Archduke's assassination would transform into an international crisis that would test the European diplomatic system to its breaking point. The immediate repercussions in Sarajevo were merely the opening act in a drama that would soon engulf the continent and the world. Diplomatic dominoes. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand might have remained a tragic but contained incident in the volatile Balkans. Instead, it triggered a cascade of diplomatic maneuvers, ultimatums, and fateful decisions that would transform a local crisis into global conflict. The period between the assassination on June 28th and Austria-Hungary's declaration of war on Serbia on July 28th, known as the July Crisis, represents one of history's most consequential diplomatic failures. During these critical weeks, Europe's leaders made a series of decisions that collectively led to catastrophe, even as each step seemed reasonable or necessary to those taking it. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, Austria-Hungary's leaders faced a crucial decision: how to respond to what they perceived as a direct attack on the imperial house by Serbian-backed terrorists. The initial reaction in Vienna was not immediate war, but rather a determination to use the crisis to resolve the Serbian problem once and for all. Foreign Minister Leopold Berchtold, who would play a central role in the coming crisis, saw an opportunity to eliminate Serbia as a threat to the empire's stability and territorial integrity. Before taking action, however, Austria-Hungary sought assurance of German support. On July 5th, Emperor Franz Joseph sent a handwritten letter to Kaiser Wilhelm II, delivered personally by Count Alexander Hoyos, a senior diplomat. This Hoyos mission represented a critical moment in the July crisis. The letter outlined Vienna's view that the assassination was the direct result of Serbian agitation and that a final and fundamental reckoning with Serbia had become necessary. Germany's response, delivered on July 6th, would become known as the blank check, an unconditional assurance of support for whatever action Austria-Hungary decided to take against Serbia. Kaiser Wilhelm II told the Austrian ambassador, "You can be sure that His Majesty will stand loyally by our side in accordance with his obligations as an ally and as a friend." Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg reinforced this position, adding that Austria should act quickly before other powers could intervene. This German assurance fundamentally altered the dynamics of the crisis. Without it, Austria-Hungary might have pursued a more cautious approach, fearing isolation if Russia came to Serbia's defense. With German backing, however, Berchtold and the war party in Vienna gained the upper hand in internal debates. The blank check effectively transferred significant decision-making power from Vienna to Berlin, yet Germany offered this support without imposing conditions or even knowing precisely what actions Austria-Hungary planned to take. Even with German support secured, divisions within the Austro-Hungarian leadership delayed immediate action. Hungarian Prime Minister István Tisza initially opposed war, fearing that annexing additional Slavic territories would further destabilize the empire's delicate ethnic balance. He also worried that Russian intervention could prove disastrous. Tisza's opposition forced Berchtold to proceed more cautiously than he might have preferred. By July 14th, however, Tisza had been persuaded to support action against Serbia, provided that Austria-Hungary would not annex Serbian territory. With this internal consensus achieved, Berchtold and his colleagues began drafting an ultimatum to Serbia. The document was deliberately crafted to be unacceptable, containing demands that no sovereign state could be expected to accept in full. As the Russian ambassador in Vienna later observed, the ultimatum was formulated in a way that made it almost impossible for Serbia to accept it. While Vienna deliberated, other European powers remained largely unaware of the brewing crisis. French President Raymond Poincaré and Prime Minister René Viviani were on a state visit to Russia from July 2023, discussing the strengthening of the Franco-Russian alliance, but paying little attention to the Balkan situation. British attention was focused on the increasingly volatile situation in Ireland, where civil war seemed imminent. This distraction of the Entente powers created a diplomatic vacuum that Austria-Hungary and Germany were able to exploit. On July 23rd, nearly a month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary finally delivered its ultimatum to Serbia. The timing was deliberate. Poincaré and Viviani were still at sea returning from Russia, limiting France's ability to coordinate with its ally. The ultimatum contained 10 demands, including suppression of publications hostile to Austria-Hungary, dissolution of nationalist organization Narodna Odbrana and similar societies, elimination of anti-Austrian teaching in Serbian schools, removal of military and civil officials deemed guilty of anti-Austrian propaganda, acceptance of Austro-Hungarian representatives in the suppression of anti-Austrian movements, judicial proceedings against accessories to the assassination plot, arrest of 2 named Serbian officials implicated in the plot, prevention of illegal traffic of weapons across the border, explanations regarding anti-Austrian statements by Serbian officials, immediate notification of compliance with these measures. Most significantly, the 5th point would have allowed Austro-Hungarian officials to operate within Serbia, effectively compromising Serbian sovereignty. The ultimatum demanded a response within 48 hours, by 6:00 p.m. on July 25th. The delivery of the ultimatum immediately transformed the crisis from a bilateral dispute into an international concern. European chancelleries recognized the document's severity and the threat it posed to peace. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, described it as the most formidable document ever addressed by one state to another that was independent. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov declared, "This is war," upon learning of its contents. Serbia faced an impossible dilemma. Accepting the ultimatum in full would effectively surrender national sovereignty, while rejecting it would almost certainly lead to war with a much stronger power. Prime Minister Nikola Pasic, who had returned hastily to Belgrade from an election campaign, sought a middle path that might satisfy Austria-Hungary enough to avoid war while preserving Serbian independence. The Serbian response, delivered just before the deadline on July 25th, represented a masterpiece of diplomatic finesse. Serbia agreed to most of the demands, including suppressing anti-Austrian publications, dismissing implicated officials, and arresting conspirators. On the critical 5th point, however, Serbia offered only to accept such collaboration as agrees with the principle of international law, with criminal procedure, and with good neighborly relations. This qualified acceptance allowed Serbia to appear reasonable to international opinion while still protecting its sovereignty. The response concluded with an offer to refer any disputed points to the International Court at The Hague or to the Great Powers. By any objective standard, the Serbian reply was conciliatory, so much so that Kaiser Wilhelm II, upon reading it, remarked, "A brilliant performance for a time limit of only 48 hours. This is more than one could have expected. A great moral victory for Vienna, but with it every reason for war drops away." The Kaiser's assessment, however, came too late. Baron Giesel, the Austro-Hungarian minister in Belgrade, had been instructed to reject anything short of complete acceptance. After a cursory reading of the Serbian response, he broke diplomatic relations and departed Belgrade on the evening of July 25th. Austria-Hungary immediately began mobilizing for war. As the crisis escalated, frantic diplomatic efforts began to prevent conflict. Gray proposed a conference of ambassadors from France, Germany, Italy, and Britain to mediate the dispute, a mechanism that had successfully diffused the Balkan crisis of 1912-13. Germany rejected this proposal, insisting that the matter remained a bilateral issue between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Russia, as the self-proclaimed protector of Slavic peoples, could not remain passive in the face of an Austrian attack on Serbia. On July 24-25, the Russian Council of Ministers decided to begin preliminary military preparations. On July 26th, Russia announced a partial mobilization affecting only military districts bordering Austria-Hungary, intended as a warning rather than a direct threat. The Russian decision to mobilize, even partially, dramatically raised the stakes. Military mobilization in this era was not simply a precautionary measure, but represented a nearly irreversible step toward war. Once set in motion, the complex timetables of troop movements, railway schedules, and supply arrangements were extremely difficult to halt or reverse. Furthermore, the German war plan, the famous Schlieffen Plan, was predicated on rapid mobilization and deployment before Russia could fully prepare its forces. Any Russian mobilization, therefore, created enormous pressure for Germany to respond with its own mobilization. On July 27th, Gray made a final attempt to salvage peace by proposing direct talks between Austria and Russia. This initiative briefly seemed promising, with the Austrian government showing some willingness to discuss the Serbian response. However, on July 28th, before these talks could begin, Austria-Hungary formally declared war on Serbia and began artillery bombardment of Belgrade the following day. The declaration of war triggered the alliance systems that had divided Europe. Russia proceeded from partial to general mobilization on July 30th, despite desperate telegrams between Tsar Nicholas II and Kaiser Wilhelm II, cousins who addressed each other as Nicky and Willie, attempting to find a peaceful resolution. The German government, viewing Russian mobilization as an existential threat, delivered an ultimatum demanding that Russia halt all military preparations within 12 hours. When Russia failed to comply, Germany declared war on August 1st and began its own mobilization. The Schlieffen Plan required Germany to attack France before turning east against Russia, and on August 2nd, Germany demanded free passage through neutral Belgium to attack France. When Belgium refused, German troops invaded on August 4th, triggering British entry into the war based on the 1839 Treaty of London, guaranteeing Belgian neutrality. Within a week of Austria-Hungary's declaration of war on Serbia, all the major European powers had been drawn into the conflict. The diplomatic dominoes had fallen in a sequence that transformed a Balkan crisis into a world war. The July crisis reveals several critical failures that collectively led to catastrophe. First, the Austrian delay between the assassination and the ultimatum allowed emotions to harden rather than dissipate. Second, Germany's blank check encouraged Austrian intransigence while failing to moderate the ultimatum's terms. Third, the alliance systems transformed a local conflict into a continental one through automatic commitments. Fourth, military planning and mobilization schedules created a momentum toward war that diplomacy could not restrain. Finally, poor communication between capitals and the absence of effective international mediation mechanisms left no path to de-escalation once the crisis began. Perhaps most tragically, at several points during the July crisis, opportunities existed to break the chain of escalation. Had Austria-Hungary accepted Serbia's largely conciliatory response? Had Germany supported Gray's conference proposal? Had Russia limited itself to diplomatic protests rather than mobilization? Or had the great powers agreed to localize the conflict, the catastrophe might have been averted. Instead, a combination of miscalculation, fear, honor, and rigid military planning led Europe into an abyss from which it would emerge 4 years later, fundamentally transformed. The July crisis stands as a sobering reminder of how diplomatic failures can lead to consequences far beyond what any participant intended or predicted. As the German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg reportedly remarked as the war began, "How did it all happen?" The answer lay in the diplomatic dominoes that fell, one after another, in that fateful summer of 1914.